So I'm really delighted to welcome you all this evening. I should have said I'm Abigail Brundin, the director of the British School at Rome, and I'm speaking on behalf of myself and Catherine Harlow, my co-director at the Institute for Classical Studies, both of us newly inaugurated in our posts and both really committed to this exchange, to its future life. So the idea of this collaboration is that it is really founded in research. It's a research collaboration. A researcher from Italy goes to London and speaks about their research there. That bit is pending. And a researcher comes from the UK to Italy to talk about, some aspects of their cutting edge, path-breaking research in Italy for an audience here. But with the wonders of modern technology, we can share these events as well. Of course, we're cheating slightly because tonight's speaker is effectively returning to her home territory, but she is very much owned by the United Kingdom in professional terms, at least in some ways. I was watching back the introduction by Catherine's predecessor, Greg Wolfe, and he described the relationship between these two institutes as a happy relationship. And I know I speak for both of us in saying that we want that to continue. As the new incumbents, we're very committed to having a future happy relationship to build on. So we're really excited that we're back in this room. I'm going to leave the kind of subject-specific and research-specific introductions to my colleague, Emlyn Dodd, our Assistant Director in Archaeology. So I'm going to pass the microphone to him to introduce tonight's event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abby. I don't need to say it anymore, but welcome everyone. It's really amazing to have people back in the building again after a somewhat slow start to 2022, and fantastic to kick it off tonight with our joint ICS-BSR lecture. Before I introduce our speaker and our event tonight, just a few reminders for those online and here in person. Of course, there'll be opportunities to ask questions. For those watching online from home or wherever you are, feel free to type them at any time into the Q&A function, and we'll get around to coming to those after the lecture. And for those of you here in person, of course, you can raise your hand at the end and we'll bring a microphone around and you can ask them live. And also, just to make sure everyone is aware that tonight's lecture is being recorded. So our speaker this evening is Dr. Corinna Riva, who will be discussing pre-Roman cities and religion between Etruria and Iberia. Corinna is Associate Professor at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL, as well as a valued member of the BSR's Faculty of Arts, History and Letters. She's published on urbanization, funerary practices and the socioculture of Etruscan Italy, including a recent monograph, A Short History of the Etruscans via Bloomsbury. She also has broad interests in the non-Greco-Roman Mediterranean, looking at comparative histories and archaeologies, and I look forward to hearing more about this tonight, I hope. So it gives me great pleasure tonight to welcome Corinna to deliver our first ICS-BSR lecture of 2022.
Well, thank you very much, Abigail and Emlyn, for the kind introduction. I wanted to start by a few thanks. First of all, to Catherine Harlow and Abigail Brundin for inviting me, and it's a great honor to be here for the first live event of 2022, and I'm not quite sure who is following us online, but there might be a way to say good afternoon rather than only good evening. I also wanted to say that often these kind of public lectures are given on themes that one works on or has been working on for some time. I just want to break a little bit with this tradition since this year, and this is another thanks that I wanted to give publicly to the Max Weber Colleg of the German University of Erfurt, where I am presently for this year one of the distinguished fellows there, to carry out a project on which I have been working on since October, So this is very much a work in progress, and I look forward to the discussion because I am basically trying ideas out. So many thanks to the Max Weber colleague in Erfurt. Okay. Archaeology is living a renewed phase, which many called global archaeology. This is nothing particular to the discipline. It is rather part of a wider approach to the research questions we ask in the social and historical sciences, which, like many other broader fields, has been exploiting the analytical potential of big data, which have facilitated this global approach. You might ask, what do we mean by that? Well, socio-historical phenomena such as the formation and endurance of states, urbanism, colonialism, power relations, and social inequalities are now more frequently tackled on a global scale, embracing extremely diverse and wide geographical and cultural regions. And this slide gives you an example of this kind of research. Interestingly, among these phenomena, one that has come under the radar in this scholarly trend is the urban process, which is undoubtedly the consequence of multiple scholarly developments from the application of innovative investigative methods, most notably remote sensing technologies such as LIDAR, and new findings facilitated by these technologies, to the dialogue that archaeology entertains with its own wider field. In relation to this dialogue, it is worth borrowing the words of Jörg Rucke, one of the researchers with whom I'm working at the Max Weber Collective this year, and I quote from his recent book, Urban Religion. "Urban studies are flourishing. That this should be so is no surprise. For the first time in human history, we are now at a point at which more than half of the global population lives in cities. In 2016, 35 cities had populations above the thresholds of 10 million inhabitants. Megacities and large metropolitan areas are the economic backbones of global production and exchange." The term megacity takes us to another of these scholarly developments, namely new findings, which have forced us to reconsider definitions and interpretive models of the urban category. Megacity or megasite is also the term used to define the truly vast Tripilia sites in Ukraine of the 4th millennium BC, which represent the largest early prehistoric planned settlement, certainly in Europe, if not beyond, reaching, in one case, up to 320 hectares, so really enormous sites. These sites, which its excavators have identified as the earliest known cities, characterized by low-density occupation, have in fact revived the debate on the archaeology of cities on a global scale. And this has gone hand in hand with the recognition of the tremendous variability of ancient urbanism, and therefore the importance of comparativism. The lesson we have learned from all these developments is that there is no monolithic urban form, nor is there a linear evolution of urbanism, or indeed stability associated with it. Most recently, The Dawn of Everything by anthropologists and archaeologists David Graeber and David Wengrow, a book that set itself the grand ambition of transforming how we think of the human past, has also tackled ancient cities and their variability, but focusing specifically on what archaeologists often refer to as social complexity, which we normally associate with urbanism. In drawing from diverse evidence across time and space, the plea that these authors make is that we recognize that this association between urbanism and social complexity was by no means the norm. Sociopolitical relations in ancient cities did not necessarily evolve into hierarchical ones. On the contrary, some cultural and geographical urban contexts point to remarkable forms of cooperation, and therefore the generation of so-called heterarchical relationships. A bottom-up rather than top-down perspective of urban relations, therefore, is timely, according to Graeber and Wengrow. This in turn prompts us to ask afresh questions on the agency of those who make up the community of these urban settlements, even where social and political hierarchies did develop. Indeed, it may be argued that with lively debates on what the urban form entails, and no consensus reached precisely because of the global scale considered, attention has shifted towards urban dwellers, their collective decision-making in the functioning of cities, and hence civic identities, social cohesion, membership to the urban or citizen community. These aspects raise in turn the question on the mechanisms by which membership was articulated, if at all. Insofar as Mediterranean antiquity of the first millennium BC is concerned, the Greco-Roman mechanism for this is citizenship, for which the Greek and especially Athenian world has received the lion's share of attention thanks to the remarkably rich documentary base from literary to material. This may explain why recent approaches to citizenship have employed Athenocentric and more precisely Aristotelian concepts as a shorthand reference to Mediterranean antiquity. However, this shorthand usage severely reduces the potential for comparative analysis within the first millennium BC Mediterranean, where other kinds of mechanisms may have been at play. Indeed, what the Mediterranean of this period has to offer is a remarkable laboratory for comparative analysis, where solutions to urban living were as variegated and highly regionalized as the societies that developed them. The first millennium BC Mediterranean, in other words, gives us the opportunity to see the variabilities on cities that global approaches have highlighted, but through a much finer grained lens. In fact, recent studies in Greek history of the Archaic period, that is to say, the late 7th to the 5th century BC, have themselves rethought this Aristotelian model of citizenship, making us reflect further upon the relationship between citizenship, community, and heterarchy. By Aristotelian model, Greek historians refer to Book 3 of Aristotle's Politics, devoted to criteria for citizenship, where key is the citizen's ability to participate in decision-making and in the city's activities, such as offices and liturgies. Some historians, most prominently the Dutch historian Josien Blok, have recently unequivocally jettisoned this model as a construct and the evolutionary thinking associated with it, according to which primitive form of archaic citizenship only evolved into a complete form in classical Athenian democracy. Some historians now acknowledge citizenship as fluid, dynamic, open, in the development of ties and bonds to the urban community with no predictable outcome or single solutions, and the emphasis seen in archaic and classical Greek texts upon participation in religion rather than strictly political participation. The covenant between the members of the polis and the gods, to use a term employed by Blok herself, its rules and regulations on religious matters, such as sacrifice, delineated both community and participation, or in one word, citizenship, along with dissent, real or metaphorical, and law. So according to Blok's perspective, citizenship was constituted by shared cult, dissent, and law. More generally, it has now been suggested that across the Greek world of the first millennium BC, citizenship was a multifarious phenomenon, constantly shifting through changing sociopolitical circumstances. When it comes to the non-Greek Mediterranean, the correlation between religion and urbanism has been made before and is in some cases well acknowledged. This is the case with Tyrrhenian Central Italy, southern Etruria in particular, where the emergence of religious monumental architecture in the course of the 6th century has been understood as an urban phenomenon. And here on the slide you have the example from Tarquinia, whose excavation is directed by and led by the Università Statale di Milano. And even where attempts have been made to adjust this correlation, for instance by Charlotte Potts in her book on religious architecture, who has focused instead and the wider network of cross-cultural interaction, one cannot fail to recognize that such a network was facilitated by urban nodes. Similarly, in the case of some regions of the Iberian Peninsula, the establishment of sanctuaries associated with urban centers has been interpreted as evidence of the role that religion played in fostering social cohesion within communities. Yet the question remains, what is this correlation about? Did religious worship, in whichever form it took and how it was expressed, provide a space for the articulation of membership to the urban community in ways that are similar or perhaps distinct from what historians have recently argued for the Greek world? If so, how and to what extent? In this lecture, I would like to address these questions by exploiting our Mediterranean comparative laboratory, so to speak, with the aid of recent political theory on citizenship and community. I will first introduce southern Etruria and southeastern Iberia and draw out for both the evidence related to the sacred urban nexus, illustrating the exemplary comparison, at least in my view, that these regions provide. I will then move on to explain how and why political theory is useful to interpret this evidence, expanding on two specific concepts recently developed by so-called ontological approaches in political philosophy. Firstly, indebtedness, and secondly, the proper in the exclusionary dimension of community. In the final part of this lecture, I will seek to apply these concepts to southern Etruria and southeastern Iberia, proposing that through distinct forms of expression in each case, religion did provide the space for the proper and indebtedness, which were both realized spatially and materially. We shall see whether, through indebtedness and the proper, religion was a mechanism by which membership to the urban community was articulated. So to southern Etruria and southeastern Iberia, two regions where urban states were respectively characterized by hierarchical and heterarchical relations, providing an insightful contrast. South Etruria, home to large city-states that were Rome's closest neighbors, was composed of highly centralized, long-lasting urban states that bore some key resemblances as well as differences to Rome. Hierarchical relationships are as enduring as the life of the city-states themselves, an aspect that has been fully demonstrated by important studies, such as those of Cristiano Iaia, on some of the early Iron Age necropolis developing around the vast plateau of what will become large urban agglomerations. Along with the archaeological evidence, the rich epigraphic documentation records personal family names and affiliations, including the so-called gentilizio, the hereditary family name. This has given us some key insight into a kinship system which provided structure to social relations in these urban states. More than this, it is widely contended that such a system also expressed membership to the citizen body through the inherited gentilizio and therefore other forms of inheritance. Enrico Bernelli's studies of the epigraphic record and this system have shown some key aspects in this regard, which can be summarized in the following way. Firstly, the system was already well established by the early 7th century. This we know from the earliest inscriptions, which were used to express personal relations in a gift exchange, an institution primarily known from funerary contexts, as is the case of this example of a bucchero drinking cup on the slide. Secondly, extant Etruscanized foreign names indicate that membership to the urban community was open. Thirdly, the use of inscriptions broadened as non-elite individuals participated in this use in the course of the 6th century, and then from the 4th century, newly adopted membership to these affiliations by Etruscan individuals increased. All of this gives us a picture of a very dynamic society, not unlike what we see in Rome, where historians, most notably Christopher Smith, have recently radically shifted a perspective of stable social structures based upon kinship relations and group affiliations such as the gens, to one that sees an extremely competitive social environment where factions within such groups rendered their power fragile and in some instances highly volatile. Combined with the epigraphic record, the archaeology from houses to cemeteries to sanctuaries also hints at a similarly competitive and hierarchical society north of the Tiber in southern Etruria. In all of this, what instead remains a constant feature is that the use of inscriptions is restricted to ritual contexts, necropolis and sanctuaries, which therefore must have been deemed as appropriate spaces for expressing affiliations and kinship ties. We can recognize this feature along with fluctuating trends in the use of these spaces, still bearing in mind the nature of evidence, which is sadly too often dominated by these contexts. The most significant of these trends is that the broadening in the use of inscription is coeval with the monumentalisation and spatial elaboration of sanctuaries, and we shall see how this is significant. The trajectory of southeastern Iberian urbanism is radically different, both in scale and socio-political development. What follows is a reconstruction of this development in my attempt to synthesize the research of our Spanish colleagues, most notably Ignacio Graumira, who has excavated a few of these sites. The much smaller cities in the region, fortified oppida on high grounds, and you see the distribution of the oppida on the top left-hand corner of the slide, these oppida were equally characterized by social competition, which was also mostly visible in funerary contexts, but there emerges over the long term a contrasting set of profound disruptions, out of which emerged a society structured around hierarchical relations. From the 7th century, the earliest oppida were small centers, some of them very small, 2 to 5 hectares. And they acted as nodes around communication corridors controlling surplus production, part of which was channeled into them as prestige goods. This is primarily, though not solely visible in the small necropolis associated with this oppida, where the burying record was not representative of the town's populations and therefore highlights exclusionary strategies managed by a warrior elite in the ritual symbolic realm. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you see a couple of examples of the material coming from these necropolis. That this early oppida, and on the bottom left-hand side, you see a plan of one such oppida, El Puig, that these early oppida were towns rather than centers of large urban states is likely. As central places, they may have had the control of rural sites across territories that were sacralized by networks of so-called cuevas santuarios, or cave sanctuaries, which hosted what archaeologists have interpreted as elite-driven rites of initiation at liminal locations, and you can see the distributions of these cuevas santuarios on the bottom right-hand side. We can instead speak of an urban state after a radical phase of change. Towards the end of the 4th century, several of these oppida were abandoned, frequentation declined in both necropolis and cueva santuarios, and in many cases ceased completely. At the same time, some of the larger oppida survived and grew into main towns and so-called religious centers. This phrase, religious centers, is used to indicate the establishment of sanctuaries closely linked to the cities, sometimes architecture elaborated and functioning as poles of social aggregation for vast territories. And we see here an example to which I will return from La Serreta. Scholars emphasize the divergence between the earlier oppida as communities characterized by high socio-political competition and the later religious centers as spaces of cooperation. It is argued that this divergence was driven by the decentralized and hierarchical nature of political power in these urban states. Political power, which in turn was expressed in corporate strategies towards the sharing of power, and indeed we have perhaps the best evidence comes from La Serreta, where we have Bits of evidence that give us a sense of this decentralized form of political power, seen, for instance, in the dispersed distribution of writing on lead sheets, which are presumably used for trade administration. Equally, a dispersed distribution of banqueting vessels with complex iconography, underlying rituals of conviviality, which are found across different types of settlements and domestic settings, including farmhouses. But more crucially, it's the disappearance of funerary space that is of note. And La Serreta indeed exemplifies this kind of situations. In different ways, then, the ritual landscape of South Etruria and Southeastern Iberia reconfigured collective participation. Two specific features are common to both regions. Firstly, religious worship established new relations of exchange in the ritual symbolic realm. Unlike gifts circulating across elite networks of reciprocity, the votive offering at the sanctuary established a debt relation between worshipper and deity. That this was a new distinct sphere of exchange is notable in distinct ways for each region. The practice of funerary offerings declined, as we saw, in some cases ceased in southeastern Iberia, establishing the sanctuary as the exclusive space for exchange. In Etruria, the epigraphic record gives us some insightful details. Unlike elite gift exchange inscriptions, inscriptions on religious offerings, on the whole, no longer recorded the gift giver, putting emphasis upon the divinity as gift recipient and therefore closing the circle of exchange. It is notable at the same time that we see a new distinct gift-giving verb to indicate this new sphere. The second common feature of South Etruscan and Southeastern Iberian sanctuaries is their spatial and material elaboration, which in the case of Southern Etruria manifests itself in the monumentalisation of these spaces. And it is indeed reasonable to detect in this change perhaps an investment, certainly an investment by the urban state into the religious transcendent, and perhaps a kind of a control by the state of a sort of symbolic capital identified in this transcendent. But it's also worth bearing in mind that we see here a delimitation of sacred space that is owned by the deities, but is of common usage. In other words, a space that was not private nor public, at least in the ways in which we think of these attributes. At this point, it is political theory, along with studies on ancient religion, that help us not only make sense of these transformations, but also provide us a possible entry into religion as expressive of membership to the city. Greek historians themselves have made use of sociological studies to adopt a kind of a more flexible working definition of citizenship, which includes claims to certain prerogatives, responsibilities, ties, and obligations. On the other hand, studies in political philosophy have quite radically, I think, revised what makes a community vis-à-vis the concept of the proper. This revision has entailed moving away from a so-called proprietary logic originating in the liberal doctrine of property from John Locke, which has formed a sort of basis in modern Western philosophy about the state and the sovereignty of the state. A doctrine that has pretty much emphasized the role of the state in protecting the private rights of ownership and therefore the rights of its citizens. According to this logic, community is what brings subjects together in sharing a common identity and a sense of belonging. Importantly, community here is predicated upon a double act of appropriation, first towards property itself, and secondly towards reciprocal relationships within the community, effectively ratifying these relationships and therefore community itself. The first to revise this perspective in the early 1990s, French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, argued that common and proper were one the contrary of the other and therefore incommensurable. Community, he argued, is not about property or belonging, but the relationship itself, In other words, community not as something that is common or that is owned, but as being in common, where emphasis is on the relational and ontological dimension of common. Taking this further, the Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito has focused on the semantic genealogy of the concept of community, peeling it back to the Latin munus, from which communistas derives, and its dual semantics containing law and gift, which in its original meaning of communitas refers to the legal and therefore ethical obligation to give. The three senses of munus, onus, officium, donum, all conceptualized as a duty, highlight a contract of community founded on indebtedness. So, in other words, being in common is not bound by property, but by indebtedness that brings a community together through, and I quote Esposito, a transitive act of giving. A third contribution that has reframed, again, the incompatibility of proper and common is by Jacques Rancière, who has highlighted the exclusionary dimension of community. Those excluded from the common, according to Rancière, disrupt community and take a part to play in the common through their improper community via political praxis. Here, the key aspects of note in Rancière's thought are two. Firstly, proper is not only about property, but also propriety, and again I quote, a mode of decorum or a normative system for the assignment of persons in places and times. Secondly, Rancière famously defined political praxis as the partition of the sensible, or le partage du sensible, which deserves an explanation through Rancière's own words, which you can read with me on the slide. The clusters of perceptions and practices that shape this common world. Politics is first of all a way of framing among sensory data a specific sphere of experience. It is a partition of the sensible, the visible, and the sayable, which allows or does not allow some specific data to appear, which allows or does not allow some specific subjects to designate them and speak about them. It is a specific intertwining of ways of being, ways of doing, and ways of speaking. Rancière here highlights the senses as the mechanism by which we categorize reality and act upon it as subjects. In fact, as an act of subjectivation, the partition of the sensible is a form of theatricality involving performance and participation. Theatricality, performance, and participation align with recent studies of ancient religion by Jörg Rutke, who has characterized religion as a system of communication and subjectivation, where material culture, in its sensory and material affordances across time and space, played a fundamental role. So, taking all of the above together around the pivots of indebtedness and the proper, we can now return to South Etruria and Southeastern Iberia and see how and whether this can help us interpret our material evidence. Well, first of all, the delineation of sacred space through the building of sanctuaries may in fact be interpreted as a spatial reconfiguration of the proper. However, not as a static event-like phenomenon, but a continuous transformative process marked by ritual activities that partition the sensible through time and space. In southern Etruria, where fields of ritual action overlapped between sanctuary and cemetery, the epigraphic record once again enriches the context. Studies by the epigraphist Valentina Belfiore on specific lexical terms referring to ritual space have highlighted an acute awareness of spatiality across Etruria, especially for inviolable places such as tombs or specific spaces inside them, both in relation to immovable objects, the tomb itself or a niche, or movable objects such as funerary cipi, grave markers. Now, that this is documented from the archaic period, when we see the boom in sanctuary buildings, suggests the correlation of this emerging awareness with the definition of a new type of inviolable space, that of the sanctuary. Of particular interest that Belfiore emphasizes is an attestation of a term, tous, usually referring to the action or state of something in tomb spaces of later dates, on a lead balance weight that you see here on the slide from the Sant'Antonio sanctuary inside the city of Cere, devoted to Hercle, the Etruscan counterpart of Greek Heracles, where the term tous is related to Etruscan methlum, which refers to the space, the physical space of the city. In other words, in pointing to the city as a larger container than the space of the sanctuary, according to Belfiore, the inscription alludes to a close spatial relationship between ritual and urban of a very specific, let's say, container kind. Bringing together all the space defining terms, Belfiore has convincingly drawn a lexical hierarchy according to the spatial scale of containment of each term, from a smaller place inside a structure, a niche in a tomb, a cell of a sanctuary, to the entire urban space. Two of these terms, Muni and Tamera, occur in the earliest attestations at another sanctuary of Cere, at its coastal port, Pirgi, which I'll come back to, in a famous dedication by a ruler of Cere, Tefare Velianas, on some famous golden plaques from an area of the monumental temple complex. And this, interestingly, further suggests that the monumentalisation and elaboration of sanctuaries went hand in hand with this growing awareness of spatiality. It's also interesting that Belfiore points out how Muni, in an articulated lexical form, also came to refer to a type of magistracy, indicating the process by which spatiality itself was later institutionalized. In southeastern Iberia, a region where we lack such a rich epigraphic documentary base, we can still detect a comparable yet distinct sense of spatiality in its reconfiguration, indicated by the decline of the socially exclusive rituals at the Cueva Santuario, coeval to the establishment of sanctuaries. Here we may argue that the reconfiguration of the proper was affected by movement, centripetal in the case of the Cueva Santuarios, which were placed at liminal location across the landscape, and the map on the top right-hand corner shows you the location of these cuevas in relation to the oppida. So from a centripetal movement to a centrifugal in the case of the sanctuaries, since, as I mentioned, the sanctuaries were adjacent to the city and overlooked a vast territory of smaller sites, acting as points of aggregation. However, it was religious worship ultimately, and the indebtedness which it induced, which partitioned the sensible in a continuously transformative process. This is reflected in the offerings themselves, and more specifically, in the ways in which the affordances of material culture, broadly conceived, enabled indebtedness, from agricultural produce turned into votive libations, to specific sets of artifacts, objects of the exchange, or indeed the representation of such an exchange, together with the actual ornamentation of cult buildings, in the case of southern Etruria, which involved another kind of representation, that is to say, the representation of the divine. Here again, a comparison between the two regions provides an insightful contrast, which I want to illustrate with one example for each. I come back to Cere and the previously mentioned coastal sanctuary at Pirgi, investigated by La Sapienza University here in Rome, today under the lead of Laura Michetti. Pirgi is exemplary, as you can see from this map from La Sapienza, in that we're talking about a large sanctuary complex, not simply the sanctuary of the coastal port of Cere, but arguably a sanctuary urbanized into a maritime monumental facade, so to speak, that we know began at the city via a monumental road. Pirgi is also blessed, thanks to the long-term investigation by La Sapienza, with a superb, if not unique, preservation of its primary depositions, many of which have been published while awaiting the final publication. The complex itself was formed by three areas: the central monumental area, enclosing two monumental temples, non-monumental areas to the south, it's the so-called southern sanctuary, and a densely built northern area hosting a group of public ceremonial buildings, as they have been called, fresh from recent excavations and therefore subject to provisional interpretations. It is from the primary depositions of the two latter areas to the south and north of the temple complex that we can get a sense of the wide range of ritual acts enabled by the multiple affordances of material culture. The range is particularly observable in the careful votive deposition at altars of the southern area, which indicate cults to specific deities such as Demeter and Dionysos, and rites of consecration of the space and of specific structures within it, which involve, for instance, the bearing of jewelry and the pouring of specific quantities of molten lead. The depositions near the altars that you see on a plan on the top left-hand corner were the results, among others, of libations and in some cases of remarkable rigor in the execution of ceremonies, which have been detected in the strict order in which the offerings were deposited, as is the case of the foundational deposit row, which you see on the slide on the right-hand corner. This rigor was perhaps a reflection of new religious norms, a new proper. As remarked by the excavators themselves, this may be in fact one of the earliest sanctuaries devoted to the cult of Demeter in Etruria. This goes hand in hand with what must have been a very dynamic religious environment, where some inscriptions attest to the cult of Kavata, a female chthonic deity, coupled with her male counterpart, Suri, also known from other sanctuaries. Importantly, as the excavators themselves have noted, the altars' locations were not determined by an overall planning of this area, as is the case, for instance, in the monumental part of the complex, but rather by the actual acts of religious worship. If Pirgi gives us such a rich picture of indebtedness and dynamic reconfiguration of the proper in religion, the southeastern Iberian city of La Serreta, an open-air sanctuary located, as you can see, quite a spectacular location of a sanctuary right next to the settlement at the edge of a high promontory overlooking a wide valley. And we see illustration of these processes in a different way. La Serreta holds the largest corpus, over 400, according to the latest typology, of terracotta figurines ever found anywhere in pre-Roman Iberia, and sadly, the only votive material known from this site. The figurines, deposited in the space of about 250 years between the 3rd and the 1st century, represent a range of human figures, from schematic ones to male and female full figures, heads, faces, including a series of incense burners. Latest research has interpreted these figures as representations of offerers of different social status, from roughly made schematic figures to carefully made heads with highly elaborated hairstyles and jewelry. High status offerings have been identified in this latter, which are also found in other sanctuaries in the region and in ritualized domestic contexts, and this have led scholars to interpret some of them, in fact, as representing family ancestors. Archaeometric analysis that has been applied to the material has also ascertained the provenance of the clay and most probably of the figurines themselves, which partly matches the archaeological analysis for types that are locally distributed, and in other cases points to the distant origins. This is very interesting because it hints at a much wider sphere of religious interaction beyond the alleged territory under the control of La Serreta. The lack of primary deposits, unfortunately, gives us no detail on the kinds of rites that led to the deposition of this material or any other kinds of activities that may have taken place there. However, the material and the wider context allows me to make some preliminary suggestions. First, the anthropomorphization of the human figure is a key change in religious worship, and a cesura with the material that was employed in the ritual activities of the cueva santuarios, which mostly related to drinking and banqueting, so lots of banqueting shapes. ceramic shapes. This must be understood in conjunction with the radical spatial reconfiguration of the proper, as I suggested earlier, that condensed the space for religious worship at a single location, and where the act of indebtedness was, in some cases of some of these figurines, literally represented in the figurines themselves. The handcraft of the figurines in various styles also merits attention. It far from indicates hasty production or a lack of specialized craftsmanship, as one might wonder at first impression, because we know that specialized craftsmanship was available, as we know from much grander stone sculptures from nearby sanctuaries, such as the Sanctuary of Cerro de los Santos. So this handcraft at La Serreta, in fact, underlies a specific stylistic register of representation, which conceptualizes the body in a modular way, as Graumira and colleagues have suggested, itself afforded by the malleability of clay, and may have something to do with the specific cult taking place at La Serreta. Now, in the wider context of the region, it is notable that urban growth coinciding with these religious centers also saw the emergence of specialized understandings of the divine, not unlike what we see in Etruria. And this is suggested by the fact that each sanctuary had a distinct body of material that was very much unlike any other. In the case of La Serreta, scholars have interpreted the urban cult as referring to female fertility divinities. What is, by contrast, distinctly different from Etruria is the fact that sanctuaries rarely acted as ritual fields for surplus offering, accumulation, or deposition. The offerings, such as jewelry and textiles, were instead represented themselves in the figurines, which were in turn representations of the exchange itself. The relationship between religious worship or action towards a divinity and its representation takes us back to the representation of the divine in the ornamentation of cult buildings in southern Etruria, which must be understood as part of a system of communication where different levels of religious significance pertain to different decorative genres, from sculptures to wall paintings and methods. This is something that I've began to explore in an article which I've published recently, following Tonio Ulcer's research on the Greek world specifically. Now, a key conceptual category here for understanding ornamental programs of cult buildings is the concept of ornament, inherent in the Greek and Latin words cosmos and ornamentum respectively, which, although different in the original meanings, both refer to the moral and social order, underlying the aesthetic order and therefore physical ornament of these buildings. We therefore may say that moral and social values drove decorative choices. At the same time, these values were expressed in a religious space where theological demands equally affected these choices. This analytical framework, I think, also works for southern Etruria, where the nature of the encounter with the gods changed when large-scale acroteria began being placed on temple roofs as statues, representing deities at the top of the hierarchy of the decorative program in the face of monumentalisation of sanctuaries, and this is particularly very well nicely seen at Pirge itself. The role of craftsmen here was crucial, not simply in introducing innovation in architectural decoration, but also in providing, through that innovation, the appropriate ornament to religious buildings. It is argued that divine images facilitated the encounter with the divinity. Again, art historical studies have proven particularly insightful for understanding the triangulation, as it were, among the deity, embodied or even being the statue, the worshipper viewing the statue, and the craftsman representing it. This ultimately leads us to the problem of representation itself, that is laid bare in the materialization and human-like embodiment of a divine, non-bodied being, and that affords its epiphany. In fact, this materialization underlies the deliberately ambiguous boundary between the permissible and impermissible in material production and craftsmanship, insofar as representations of the human body are concerned, an even more ambiguous boundary between the real and imaginary in the representation of the divine and its reception, something that has been masterfully written about by Richard Gordon back in 1979. While problematized by later Greek cultural discourses, such relationships and boundaries also must have characterized earlier religious traditions. As primarily visual or indeed sensorial, the reception of the divine, encapsulated by the Greek word theoria, meaning viewing, beholding, or sacred spectating, was anything but a passive process. On the contrary, the act of viewing divine representation was itself a ritual performance, and one in which the ontological difference between image and deity collapsed. Hence, the craftsman choices of material, stylistic form, composition, and iconography, or in fact any other figural attribute, were theological ones, implicating them in the reconfiguration of the proper. It is time to come to some conclusions. What can we draw from what I have attempted to do so far? Well, first of all, I hope to have been able to convincingly suggest that a theoretical reflection on what makes a community is useful insofar as it has helped me or led me to consider the proper and inductedness as an alternative angle from which to view and frame the religious urban nexus more generally, and particularly the complex nature of religious worship and its material and spatial manifestations in cities that cannot be reduced to a private-public dichotomy in the use of religious space. Secondly, we may convene that, understood in this way, community was built and expressed through religion and in the religious space. Was this expressing citizenship? Now, if we understand citizenship as a set of rights, responsibilities, as well as ties and obligations, changing and multifarious, even open, in a dynamic socio-political environment, then I think we can at least say that the building of community through inductedness and the establishment of the proper through the divine must have been at least one aspect of what created membership to the urban community, together with many other aspects, many of which escape us, but in the case of Etruria, we know that descent certainly was one of them, thanks to the epigraphic record that we have. And this may have even been so, even in religious spaces like Pirgi, that were particularly open to the outside worshipper, yet were also the locus of the traditional expression of kinship affiliation. Daniele Maras, who has published and studied the epigraphic record from the Southern Sanctuary, for instance, has noted the presence of traditional formulas of some of these Etruscan votive inscriptions, where the gift recipient is named using the formula of gift exchange. Last but not least, I also hope to have shown the heuristic potential of comparative analysis, but of a much finer grained perspective than what global approaches are able to pursue, which allows us to go from the macro to the micro scale and back again. Ultimately, this perspective lays bare how transformative our views of the human past can be, as the dawn of everything tries to do, once we exploit the true potential of variability, and in the case of our Mediterranean, go beyond the Greco-Roman world, which remains still a fairly small fraction of the socially and culturally variegated environment that was the Mediterranean basin of the first millennium BC. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Corinna, for a vast discussion of much evidence, and I'm sure you could go on for much longer talking about such different regions and the variability between them. We've got some time for questions now, so people that are here in person, please do raise your hand, and Harriet will be able to bring around the microphone. Also to those online, please do type in any questions to the Q&A, and we'll be able to juggle between the two audiences. But I thought I might start with one of my own while people think of what they might ask you, Corinna. Perhaps a slightly conceptual and speculative question, which might be difficult to answer, but and maybe something that picks up on some of your earlier threads that you started with, looking more broadly across the Mediterranean. I couldn't help but wonder when we're talking about all these concepts of urban development and citizenship and all these things that we're very familiar with when we look at the Greco-Roman world in particular, what the influence of archaeological bias and perhaps even our kind of colonial lens that we come to these topics with plays on traditional discourse. And here I couldn't help think of, you know, a place like Australia and the indigenous cultures there and how different the archaeological heritage is and what's even visible at times. What do these kinds of things like archaeological bias play in all these discussions we're having about urban growth and urban development and the rise of citizenship and how we recognise that through scholarship?
Thank you very much, Emmeline, for these speculative questions. Well, I think I've been having lots of discussion in Germany over these topics, and in particular, it's very interesting to talk to Greek historians because there are obviously there's a huge discussion at the moment amongst Greek historians. The view that I've actually exposed to you this evening is not shared by everyone. Josine Bloch and other scholars have suggested that we need to kind of go beyond Athens in order to really understand citizenship in a broad sense. I'm fairly convinced, but of course I'm not an historian. I kind of follow the debates. Others are not so convinced. But I think that instead of working on an archaeological, I think by archaeological bias, Emmeline, you mean a way in which we archaeologists tend to borrow from what historians debate and model their views and then transfer them into archaeological contexts that are not rich in texts and therefore difficult to interpret. And of course, Southeastern Iberian is an exemplary case. Of course, that doesn't mean that we should neglect those cases, and that's why I purposely wanted to build a project on comparative cases between Iberia and Italy. But by the same token, you know, I think that we need to really think hard what we mean by citizenship. You know, what is it that we mean? I mean, the Greco-Roman world obviously is focused on land ownership and descent. And what I found interesting in this political philosophy, if anything, more than, you know, being simply a theoretical perspective to apply to our material evidence, it's more a different angle, something good to think with in order to understand what we mean by membership to the urban community. Of course, I say citizenship because in a way it's useful as a shorthand to understand what that membership may be about. But I think, yeah, the biases are far and wide. They don't belong just to the archaeologists. And of course, when it comes to those biases, you know, I left out purposely archaic Rome because that opens a huge can of worms, which I really don't want to open. But, you know, the work of Christopher Smith in this respect is absolutely brilliant in showing us that archaic Rome, which some historians have sort of defined as the wild west or the wild jungle because of the paucity of texts in order to understand what citizenship means in early Rome. Well, you know, the work, the research of Christopher Smith has been very useful in trying to peel back, you know, ideas about citizenship that we know from much, much later sources and try to relate that peeling back onto the archaeological evidence, not without the help of political philosophy. So I'm sort of following and building up on his stuff.
Any questions from our live audience? I will check online. Okay. I Nothing online. I will then ask another question if there's nothing from. Oh yes, Ruben. Sorry. Harriet. Can we get a microphone to Ruben?
That was an absolutely mind-blowing tour de force. So thank you. Just to pick up on one tiny thread of the many threads you introduced to us today. Towards the end, as you are running out of time, I think you introduced some really exciting ideas about how the materiality of representations of the divine and the boundary between that physicality and the actual divinities begins to break down. And you are concentrating mainly on the evidence from Perugia at that stage. What is your feeling in terms of, are you seeing something different happening in your two regions, or is it essentially parallel in that respect? Or have you so far looked at Perugia primarily? That side of your argument.
Yeah, thank you, Ruben. In my sort of research program for this year, I'm going to look at 2 case studies for each region. And I've begun looking in details really only at La Serreta, only because there's such a rich body of evidence. But curiously, my other case study, which is La Luz, which is another sanctuary to the south, has different sets of material. I mean, this is what is interesting about southeastern Iberia, and where I think this idea of hierarchical relationships comes into play, in that I wonder, it's an open question which I'm, continuing to explore this year, whether the representation of the divine, explicit representation of the divine, really has to do with the hierarchical society that manifests itself also in how the divine is approached. Because we don't have the monumentalisation of sanctuaries like we do in southern Etruria. And we have offerings as opposed to, the spatial elaboration is spatial. Most of the sanctuaries are outdoor, open spaces. There are no real structures until you get really close towards the 2nd and 1st century BC, really close to the Roman period. So it's a completely different way of thinking about the sanctuary space, but no less elaborated. It's just that we think, this is why I find that the comparison so insightful, because we tend to think of monumentalisation as the only option for elaboration of a sanctuary space, when it isn't. It's actually ritual practice that elaborates the space. And the reason why I use Pirgi as one of my case studies is, well, A, because the southern sanctuary has probably a unique set of primary depositions that have been so masterfully excavated by La Sapienza University. And it really is unique. So you can really see the actual ritual act in action, as it were. But also because it is a good example of an area that is created, space is created and structured according to ritual practice only. So, there are differences and similarities, but I think, and that's why I wanted to bring together the nexus urban religion, in that the way that religion manifests itself can't be just the same just because there's a city, right? We're dealing with very different kinds of urban experiences in the 1st millennium BC Mediterranean. And those kind of experiences must have an impact on the divine and how it is represented.
Any other questions from our live audience? A question here from our online audience, Corinna. Thank you for a great talk. I wanted to check that I understood one thing properly. Do you see acroteria as cult statues functioning in the same way as cult statues at ground level, in terms of affecting interaction with the divine?
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Charlotte Potts, who has intervened. I do I do see well, not all acroteria, but certainly life-size or near life-size acroteria statues on the top of the roofs of Etruscan temple buildings. I do see them as such. I mean, I know there's a debate amongst archaeologists as to whether they are in fact cult statues. I had a huge debate in Germany about this. You know, I was told, oh, these are images, not cult statues. But in fact, you know, I'm interested, and the work of Richard Gordon in this respect has been absolutely exemplary in making us think not in terms of our own analytical categories, which are useful because, you know, we need to classify things, and it's important to be able to classify. But I think it's more interesting to think about what it is that the statue is representing. If it is representing a deity, then why not considering it as a representation of the divine? And there is this very interesting ambiguity about what is permissible to put on the roof of a temple and what is not permissible. And the fact that you have the permissible representation of a deity at some point in time, which more or less coincides, obviously, the monumentalisation of sanctuaries in Etruria is earlier, but you know, there is over the long term an overlap between the two. Then I think this is significant. I hope, Charlotte, I have answered your question, but I have published a recent article on this, so yeah, it can be read in print.
I'm seeing another question here, which I think ties nicely into one of my own, actually, that I was thinking of again. From Graham Barker, how do you think the Etruscan rural population was involved in the kind of sanctuary citizenship that you've explored? And I would add to that something that I was thinking of pushing outside the urban environment. What's happening in the suburban and the hinterland between these two different regions, which are in different climatic areas and experiencing different trajectories? How does that compare to this development of urban centres and sanctuaries that you've explored?
Thank you very much, Graham. Yes, I mean, it's another, you know, huge important aspect to analyze. I mean, I think that's my personal view, that these so-called coastal emporia that develop into monumental sanctuaries, we see it with Cere, we see it in Tarquinia with Gravisca. We now know that, well, we knew since the 1980s, but the site of Regisvilla is about to be published by Carlo Regoli, where we have a similar urban plan. I think that many of these monumental sanctuaries have always been looked at as sanctuaries that go out to the maritime and to the outside world, particularly the Greek and Phoenician world, when in fact we should think more in terms of the ways in which these territories, which include obviously the rural population and rural sites, are slowly coming to be integrated, religiously speaking. By that I mean that the sanctuary on the coast can't have just served the urban population or indeed the mariners' populations or populations from the outside. I think that this sort of expanding of elaborate religion, as it were, and the divine into the landscape is precisely a manifestation of an integration of rural and urban. So I hope that this answers your question. I mean, by focusing on the city, I did not aim at creating a disjunction between the rural and urban. In fact, on the contrary, the rural begins when the urban begins, that one doesn't exist without the other, and one is a manifestation of the other.
Time for one more question, I think. Is there any from our live audience? No, we can go back to our engaged online audience then. Final question. Can we draw any conclusions from the differences in Pyrgi between the central monumental area, the southern area, more distinguished by votives? Are there different practices within the same larger sacred space?
Thank you, Susan Bido. I mean, I don't dare speaking since, La Sapienza has been digging this site for decades. So, I mean, I think one of the, I just report what its excavators say, that obviously the southern sanctuary is, I mean, they're all part of the same complex. And I think this is something that has really come out by the excavation that has been led by Laura Michetti in the last 10 years or even more, and by people like Baglioni, who has excavated the southern area. The differences in votives, I mean, there's been suggestions before that the southern area may have been established by Greek worshippers because it's been interpreted as one of the earlier sanctuaries of Demeter. And this kind of distinguishes it from the monumental area. And this certainly may be the case, but what I find interesting from the latest excavation that also looked to the northern quarter that is currently under excavation is that there seems to me a growing vision developed by Laura Michetti that we're dealing with a huge complex and a unitary complex, but also different in each area. Of course, it doesn't help that the northern and southern quarter have been so superbly excavated. Not that the monumental quarter has not been superbly excavated, but it's a very, as many of you know, excavating sanctuary sites with different levels that across different centuries create a lot of challenges in the reconstruction of a particular slice of time, because there's a lot of depositions and redepositions and so on and so forth. So I think that somehow clouds the overall view, but I think the latest work definitely shows a very sort of dynamic area that is one connected to the other.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Corinna. I think you have well and truly earned a break now. Please join me in thanking Corinna one more time for tonight's lecture.